Chapter 20, Girding for War, the North and the South. So girding really more or less means preparing for war, and you'll see that this time frame, 1861 to 1865, is actually the extent of the Civil War. However, this chapter specifically, we're going to be talking more about the economic side of it, the political side of it, the advantages and disadvantages of the North and the South. And it's really going to be next chapter that we actually talk about the battles, the strategy, that sort of thing. So let's talk about the intro. Intro is talking about Abraham Lincoln. When it comes time for him to actually be sworn into office, he actually sneaks into Washington, D.C., partially disguised, kind of in the middle of the night, to kind of thwart any attempts of would-be assassins. So things are definitely heated when he becomes president. You could say he's actually becoming president of the United States of America, because by the time March 4th, 1861 comes around, the day he's actually sworn into office, 7 states have left the Union, and there are kind of 8 states on the border, or on like the edge, thinking about it. So really becomes president at a crucial time in United States history. And it won't be another 4 years until, we are a united country once again after 4 years of bloodshed and war. And Lincoln really, of any other president, faces probably the most trials of leadership in history. So, yeah. First section, the Menace of Secession. So this is going to talk about the section, kind of the problems the secession would create. You can almost think of it as kind of a divorce. The North and the South are kind of getting a divorce. What kind of problems would entail from that or come about because of that? So in Lincoln's inaugural address, he actually makes it very clear that there would not be conflict, there would not be war unless the South started it. And he talks about in his inaugural address, geographically speaking, secession is kind of impractical. I mean, what really divides us, at least in geography, it's not like there's a mountain range dividing us or a prominent river. It's kind of like if you were to get divorced but to live in the same house. Really what is dividing us? Like secession's kind of a foolish idea. And it would create a lot of new controversies or a lot of new problems. For example, what part of the national debt would the South have to take care of? Also, what about kind of these new territories won by the Mexican-American War? After all, it was really a lot of Southerners who had shed their blood to win these new territories. What part of these new territories, then, would the South expect to have or to own? And, what about the Underground Railroad and fugitive slaves? If they became 2 separate countries, it'd be a lot easier for runaway slaves just to make it to the North, as opposed to now when the runaway slaves had to make it almost all the way to Canada to gain their freedom. So what would they do about runaway slaves? I mean, there's just endless problems that come from secession. And really the question was, could any or all of these issues be resolved without bloodshed? The answer is no. And also internationally speaking internationally, a divided America would be much weaker than a United States. It'd be a lot easier for European powers to defy that Monroe Doctrine and start to build or start to create their own colonies once again, to start to kind of take over parts of Central America once again. So it really wouldn't have been a good thing at all. But alas, it happens anyway. Okay, next section. South Carolina assails, which means attacks, Fort Sumter. So this is kind of the first armed conflict of the Civil War. You could say the first battle. You could say the first battle of the Civil War, although maybe that's not perfectly correct, has to do with a fort called Fort Sumter. Wow, well, you know. Anyway, so when the South starts to leave, the Union starts to secede, they start taking over federal property in the South, like, arsenals, or courthouses, or mints, where they make the money. and the forts. So slowly but surely, the South is starting to kind of take control of these federally owned properties in the South. And by the time Lincoln actually becomes president, actually is in office, only 2 forts in the South are still controlled by the North, still kind of fly the stars and stripes, or the Union flag, or the Northern flag. And the most important of these 2 forts that are still left is Fort Sumter. And the thing is, Fort Sumter only had a couple of weeks of provisions left. So it was kind of like a ticking time bomb. What is Lincoln, if anything, what is he going to do about Fort Sumter? And really, Lincoln he only has bad choices, okay? So one thing he could do is just to ignore it, not to give any new provisions, not to restock, so to speak, the fort. But without provisions, Fort Sumter would have been forced to surrender, and Lincoln, as president, feels like he needs to protect this federal property. So that's kind of a choice he has, just to ignore it, to let the fort surrender. Kind of the second choice he has then is to send reinforcements. But the thing with that is South Carolina would almost undoubtedly fight back if we were to send reinforcements to this fort. So what Lincoln decides to do actually is kind of like the middle of the road approach. What he does is he lets South Carolina know that he's going to send an expedition to restock or to provision the fort with food. Okay? He makes it clear that he's not going to reinforce it. He's not sending guns. He's not sending more soldiers. He's literally just going to send, supplies necessary for the people at the fort to live. Okay, like food. Okay, so he makes this very clear. So, true to his word, the Union sends down a number of ships, and the South, or South Carolina, sees it as an act of aggression and opens fire on Fort Sumter, while crowds in Charleston applaud. So there's a bunch of kind of spectators in Charleston watching on as the South, or South Carolina, starts firing on Fort Sumter, which is controlled by the North. So after 34 hours of battle, the fort surrenders to South Carolina, and ironically, there's actually no deaths at this battle. But really, it's important because it really kind of starts to change the minds of Northerners. Before, Northerners at first a lot of them thought that the South should just be allowed to leave peacefully. Okay? But now that we see that South Carolina is being aggressive, they're firing on our fort, that attitude really changes in the North. People are now more willing to support violence in order to save the Union. The South fired on the Stars and Stripes. We need to retaliate. We're not going to take this. So the attitude in the North starts to change because of this attack at Fort Sumter. People are more willing to fight to save the Union as opposed to just letting the South go. So after Fort Sumter, Lincoln makes a call for 75,000 volunteers. Volunteers meaning soldiers who aren't drafted but actually volunteer to serve. So people respond in the North just enthusiastically, so much so that we actually have to turn some folks away. And, of course, the South sees this new recruitment, or this calling of these 75,000 troops, as another act of aggression. So because Lincoln is calling for this army of 75,000, some of these border states, or some of these states that were kind of, deciding whether to stay with the Union or go with Confederacy, they actually decide to leave the Union, join the Confederacy. So after Fort Sumter, Lincoln calls for this recruitment of 75,000 men. North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas, they leave. So they join the South. And so now the South has its full 11 states. And now that Virginia is becoming a part of the South, the Confederacy sets up their new capital in Richmond, Virginia, which is only about 100 miles away from Washington, D.C. So tensions are definitely there. Okay, next section. Brothers' blood and border blood. Okay, so this section is going to be talking about border states. Okay, so border states are states that more or less remain with the Union, but they're states that actually have slavery. So there's border states are slave states that stay with the Union. Okay, some of the border states are, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and this newly formed state of West Virginia. Before, Virginia was just one state, but the western part of Virginia, kind of up in the mountains, had a heavy population of those white mountain men. So kind of illegally, these white mountain men in the western part of Virginia actually kind of create their own state in order to stay a part of the Union. So we have kind of 5 border states now, states that have slavery but decide to stay with the Union. And, if the North had been more aggressive, if it had been the North that kind of fired the first shot, most, if not all, border states probably would have joined the Union. And these border states were a huge loss from the South. I mean, they lost population, they lost the manufacturing facilities in these border states, they lost like horses and mules they would have had, and especially control of a lot of the major rivers, especially like the Ohio River. They lost those because the border states decided to stick with the Union. And Lincoln is famous for having said he hoped to have God on his side, but he had to have Kentucky, just really showing how important these border states were. Okay, and now Lincoln is really calculating what he says, what actions he does, with having kind of the border states in the back of his mind, because he does not want to upset the border states. He knows they're so crucial that they remain with the Union. So, for example, at first when we're starting to fight, he actually formally declares that he is fighting, or the Union is fighting, the North is fighting to save the Union, not to free the blacks. Because wanting these border states, these slavery states, to stay with the Union, he makes it officially known that he is fighting this war to save the Union. It's not about slavery, we want to save the Union. Yeah, so for example, there's 5 of these states are actually slave states, so it's not really, the North is free of slaves and the South is full of slaves. There's slavery on both sides. They give an example. There's a region or an area kind of southern Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio called the Butternut region, and this region is full of kind of people who had migrated from the South, and why they didn't have slavery. They were definitely, it was kind of like a hotbed of pro-slavery sentiment. So just kind of showing the point that there was slavery really on both sides of this war. All right, so let's talk about the Indians, or the Native Americans. What did they do during this war? Well, the vast majority, especially of the 5 civilized tribes, were actually kind of joined the war on the Confederacy side. So you could say, in general, the Indians were fighting for the South. And, even most notably, the Cherokees owned slaves themselves. So the natives definitely fought on the side of the South, and the South welcomed them. They invited natives to send delegates to the Confederates Congress. The South started to take over federal payments to the tribes, really treated the tribes, or these natives, very, very well. Okay, and like I said, there was kind of just setting up both sides. The North was called the Union. We'll refer to it as the Union. They wore the blue uniforms, and kind of their mascot, if you would, their typical soldier would be called Billy Yank. So the Yanks are in the North, they're called the Union, they're wearing the blue. The South is then called the Confederacy. They're wearing gray, and their kind of mascot, or their typical soldier, is kind of nicknamed Johnny Reb. So we have Billy Yank in the North, Johnny Reb in the South, and they're going to fight it out. Yeah, and like the section kind of hints to in its title, the title is Brothers' Blood. Okay, there were kind of brothers against brothers, especially in these border states. You'd see a family where one brother would go and fight for the North, and then that same family, another brother would go fight for the South. Even Even Lincoln's brothers-in-laws from Kentucky actually fought for the South. So in some cases, it was really brother against brother. Yes. All right. Anyway, all right, next section, the balance of forces. So this section is going to be talking about the advantages and disadvantages the North and the South had. So let's start with the South. South's advantages. Okay, for the firstly, they're fighting a defensive war. Okay, so the South is typically going to be on the defense. So a lot of the battles we'll see during this war actually take place in the South. So the South is fighting defensively, and in order to gain or to keep their independence, the South didn't have to conquer the North. They more or less had to stick in there until the North gave up. Okay, so it was the North's job to kind of conquer this huge territory of the South, and as long as the South kept fighting, as long as the South didn't give up, the South was going to probably get their independence. Also, they had home field advantage. A lot of the fighting happened in the South, and they were really fighting for their way of life. Remember, we talked about last chapter, they really saw themselves kind of as the second revolution. They were fighting for a common goal, kind of just to preserve their way of life, that self-determination of government. We should be able to, govern as we see fit. Okay, a huge advantage of the South was their generals. Remember, we talked about how in the South, especially among those wealthy plantation owners, they had a lot more leisure time to send their kids to study at the best schools, and they had felt this kind of responsibility to become these good leaders. So the South definitely had better generals, okay, not necessarily politicians, but generals definitely in the South. And we see that a huge example would be Robert E. Lee from Virginia. Actually, before Virginia left the Union, Lincoln had tried to recruit General Lee to fight for the North, but once Virginia as a state decided to leave the Union after Lincoln's kind of recruitment of these 75,000 soldiers, Lee decided that he had to stick true to his native-born Virginia, and so Lee actually went to the South. But Lee is a huge plus to the South. Also, another famous leader we'll see, another famous general, is Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Both of these are huge generals and big advantages for the South. And also Southern society, like I kind of hinted at before, kind of bred soldiers, or really had their society really created wonderful soldiers, because a lot of these boys were used to handling guns. They were used to riding horses. They were bred, more or less, to become good soldiers. So that would be a huge advantage once it comes time to fight. And although, the South didn't have a lot of factories, they were able to get weapons. They seized some weapons from federal arsenals. They were able to steal from Union ships. They developed some of their own ironworks or some of their own factories, and they were able to kind of get around the naval blockade the North had kind of imposed on them. So while they didn't have a lot of industry, they kind of made do here and there, getting what they could. However, nonetheless, kind of some disadvantages. Over time, the South really did run short of a lot of crucial things. They had severe shortages of things as basic as shoes, of blankets, of uniforms, and although the South was definitely very agriculturally based, there was a huge lack of food, not because the food didn't exist, but it was more due to like a supply problem. The South had really poor transportation, so while there might be plenty of food to go around, they couldn't get it to where it needed to be, so there was at times a definite lack of food in the South. One of the Southern officials is said to have yelled while attacking the North, so this is a Southern officer yelling as they attack the North, "Forward, men! They have cheese in their haversacks." That's good reason to fight. Man, they have cheese. If you kill them, you get the cheese. Wonderful. So you can see there's definitely some lack of supplies on the southern side. So all in all, you can see the biggest weakness of the South was really their economy. By far, biggest weakness of the South was their economy. Okay. On the kind of flip side, the biggest strength of the North was the economy. So the biggest weakness in the South economy, the biggest strength in the North was the economy. So the North had both farms and factories, which is a great thing. In fact, they had about 3/4 of the nation's wealth and about 3/4 of their railroads. So the North definitely had a much better system of transportation, which is very good when it comes to war. Also, the North had control of the seas. They had a better navy, and they were able to create this naval blockade of the South. So they sent ships kind of down to the major southern ports to ensure that the South can't import goods from Europe and can't export goods to Europe. So the South was more or less kind of cut off from the rest of the world. And we'll see that come into play later on. So this naval blockade kind of cutting off its supply lines. Also, the North was able to trade grain for weapons with Europe. So the North, we have our lovely new invention of McCormick Reaper. We have this kind of huge influx or a huge increase in the amount of grain we can produce, while at the same time, especially in Britain, Britain had been going through a number of years of kind of poor or weak harvests. So the United States had a surplus of grain, while Europe, especially Britain, was lacking in grain. So we were able to sell our excess grain to Europe. In exchange, we would buy armaments like guns, ammunition, that sort of thing. Another plus of the Union, or of the North, is population. We had 22 million people, while the South only had about 9 million free persons and about 3.5 million slaves. So the North definitely had more people, which is always a plus. And not even just, and still even during a war, between 61 and 65, about 800,000 European immigrants actually arrived in the North. And a lot of those immigrants that arrived fought for the North. So all told, about every 1 in 5 Union soldiers was foreign-born, or had been a recent immigrant, or had not been a part of the United States for a long time. So a huge portion of our army was actually foreign-born people. Some units actually gave commands in 4 different languages to make sure everyone knew what was going on. Yeah. And like what we're seeing, the Southern boys were kind of more prepared for the life of a soldier just because of, being around guns, being around horses. But the North really kind of got their act together fairly quickly. They adjusted themselves and became really known for their discipline and for their determination. So, we got our act together in the end. Some kind of weaknesses, I guess you could say, of the North then is, we just didn't have very good military leadership. We just had a hard time finding good generals. Lincoln had to kind of do a trial and error method. So he'd give a general a shot. The general would do a bad job. He'd replace him with a new guy. The new guy wouldn't do a good job. So Lincoln had to go through a number of generals before he actually found one that really was kind of in it to win it. And we found that in the person of Ulysses S. Grant. So it was kind of trial and error on Lincoln's side before he actually found a general who was, determined to win at all costs. So, overall, on paper, the North definitely had more advantages than the South, okay? The North definitely was, we talked about their economy was such a stronghold in the North. So the North definitely had, more advantages. But still, there was a lot of what-ifs. It was really anybody's game, okay? So some what-ifs you could think of, okay? So what if the border states had left the Union, okay? What if Britain or France had entered the war, What if the North had given up and signed an armistice instead of continuing to fight until the South actually surrendered? There's a lot of what-ifs. So while the North definitely had more advantages, it was still anybody's game because of these what-if factors. All right, well, at that, I think that's enough for this video.